rich socio-economic agenda. NCC was not just about a new constitution. There was a wealth of material about socio-economic development. And when one looks at Willy Mutunga's book, Making the Constitution from the Middle, in the appendices, you can see that richness of the reform agenda, the socio-economic agenda. Although we are very proud of the 2010 Constitution, it is still constitution making from the middle, because for a lot of the times before that, we were stopped from going to the grassroots to do intensive civic education, sensitization, mobilization, and we of course did tremendous work. That is civil reform, civil society. But there wasn't adequate, pervasive civic education to entrench the Constitution in the minds of Kenyans. So the question is, to what extent can we still do work to make the Constitution a household document, not merely because people say that Constitution guarantees our rights, it is good and all that kind of stuff, but the document becomes second nature to our people in terms of what it contains, what it says for their lives, and all that kind of stuff, so that somebody can really say the way in which people learn religious books. They learn the Constitution so that it is second nature to them. Of course, it's true, people know the Katiba is valuable, it protects them, but they don't know their rights under it, and they even believe that politicians that they have elected will defend the Constitution for them. Even as we say that it's very, very important to implement the Constitution, and that there's deficit in that area, if our people do not know this Constitution intimately and what it really means from Article 1 up to the appendices, then it will still be problematic for them to be part and parcel of the implementation of this Constitution. In 2007, also 2013 and 2017, reform civil society people continue to go into elective politics and to go into government, into commissions. But when that happens, the reform content is subordinated. When they go into political parties, they are subordinated and they are tribalized, so that the reform-mindedness of these actors kind of disappears. So the question must be asked, are there any political parties which are reform-based? So that when you look at that vision, when you look at that manifesto, when you look at the leadership, you look at the representatives in elected positions, in the membership, you can say, yes, this is a party or these are parties that answer to reform orientation. And if there are a few, can they come together in a coalition? And if they are reform-oriented politicians in the existing major political parties, why are they not together in one political entity? So I think for us to really move forward, I think there has to be a census of the reform class, reform leaders, people's reform movements. When we introduced ourselves here, I really felt very warm in my heart, because even for this representation kidogo, because of course everybody couldn't come here from Kenya, but even for this representation, you can feel that people who care deeply about Kenya's citizenry have come here. And sometimes somebody can introduce themselves and you may not immediately understand and appreciate the reach they have huko mashinani. So, is it possible, like in every county, even going below, we can say, which are these groups, which are these movements? Even people here who have come to say, we have stayed in Kenya for so long without Kenya knowing we are here, without Kenya recognizing us, our dignity, our rights, our personhood, and so on. Now, these reform leaders and reform movements and reform groups and reform whatever we call it, can they begin to co-create a common vision, a people's manifesto? Because yes, we'll meet here, we'll say that we want to do A, B, C, D, but whatever it is that we want to say is the vision of the new Kenya, somehow it must come from the grassroots. Because if it does, it will have tremendous power. If you collect and collate the visions of all these groups and the people that you represent, a huge movement for the change that is required. And that is where I think people can begin to say, you know, we now want to be serious with corruption. Because if it comes from there, the people at the top cannot simply say, we are fighting corruption and nothing happens, if it comes from below. If this question of youth disempowerment comes from below with force, then it will have to be attended to. But of course, if people organize from the top, then that organization is usually weak. Again, I think this movement for reinventing Kenya needs to audit the constitution. And I think Maina said something here that this is just a meeting ya kuulizana sasa tukoje, ni nini ilienda wrong, kwa nini katiba tulipigania wakafungwa, wakauawa, wakafanywa nini, kwa nini haijaleta, how can there be so much reform struggle without reforms? So I think auditing the constitution, saying, okay, this is the constitution, and even if to get it, it was not bombers, what we wanted. It went to Kilifi, and Honorable Raila Odinga used to say, it went to Kilifi, it was mutilated, it went to Naivasha, something else happened, and it was 80%, and so on and so forth. But what is happening to it? What is not being implemented? You know, and Yashgai has done work on this. Strangely, even the Auditor General, with some MPs, did work of the audit of the Constitution. And that work was not shown a lot, was not broadcast a lot, because some of what they found out is devolution is some of the best things to happen to the country. And it should be supported, it should be reinforced. But I think there are some people who didn't want that to come out. The second thing that still I think is very, very important is the civic education on the Constitution. And I think this is something that can be done even partnering with counties. The other day the COG said, for them, if 45% of money does not come into the counties, they are not interested in the referendum. And I think this civic education on the Constitution should be also about patriotism, Kenya as a nation, not tribe, you know, because so long as Kenyans feel they belong to Kamba, they belong to Luo, to all those entities, and these are important political, organizational entities, it is good for cultural purposes. There is no problem with that. But if it is an organizing, it's a political organizing principle, then we will always be divided when it comes to the elections, referendum, whatever it is. And when you are divided, of course, you are weak. It might be important to scout for reform-minded candidates, because who is the leadership to help protect the Constitution? So scouting for reform-minded candidates for 2022, should they go into any party or a coalition of reform parties or a single reform party? If we met here and we didn't do more work so that the reform class makes itself a force that cannot be ignored. Our work has always been work where when we do a lot of work, and particularly spade work, and then we have to take a lot of time and effort to reinvent ourselves, to revive ourselves. I'm talking sometimes ourselves, sometimes yourselves. There is a crisis of identity. So the reform class has to work to make itself a force that cannot be ignored by the political class, by anybody, so that like in the 1990s, and to some extent 2000s, it can sit on its own right at the political table. Because I think if we say we want to be innocent, and we don't want to be political players, direct political players, then we are marginalizing ourselves, and we should not say politicians are marginalizing us. As I conclude, I want to talk about some factors to consider in terms of the implementation of the Constitution and the referendum. First, I said audit of the implementation of the Constitution is important. I talked about Yash Guy, 2016 Auditor General report. There are many civil society organizations which have also looked at this Constitution, also the researchers and so on. And there is a question that Gidongo asks, are we failed the Constitution, or is it the Constitution that has failed us? And I think that's an important question to answer. Because even if the Constitution it is not bombers, it is not Kilifi, it is not, even if all those things happened, but those who have studied that Constitution carefully have seen that even in that context, it is one of the most potent constitutions on the continent, and it can, if fully implemented, Kenya would change so drastically that it would be a sure peace on the continent. But the reason for this audit of the implementation, because it's from that evidence that one can argue whether there is need to change it or not. Then the second point is, could an attempt to change the Constitution lead to positive aspects of it being interfered with, especially devolution, human rights, because when it is up for grabs, you don't know what can be changed. So that's also a question that requires to be interrogated. What kind of inclusivity? I think that's also a question that we will discuss today. We also need to know, and I think Mzee Gitu made the point, that there are some changes that reform sectors are desiring, and it may not be easy to dismiss those if they are in a draft. If, for example, there was a draft which said the 2/3 gender rule now become constitutional, if there was also a proposal that 45% of annual national revenue should go to devolution. So, as we discuss whether to accept a referendum or not, we should also have at the back of our mind what would happen if some of those groups were to lay such claims, and those claims were in the Constitution. Would that form fraternity? How would it deal with that eventuality? The sixth point, I think, is the question of the process. Because one of the things that was very dear in constitution making was that the process had to be right. And there was a lot of struggle to negotiate so that there was a right process. Was good, was participatory, was pro-people, so that the product can similarly be pro-people. Of course, there's the question of the constitution by maybe some people are proposing the referendum next year. We have experienced it enough, we have implemented it enough, so that we can say now we have seen the gaps, so that now we can say it should be changed or not. As I conclude, for me, what is critical in terms of going forward is the reform movement examining itself, its strengths, its weaknesses, doing a SWOT, and then doing what is necessary together with Wanjiku to move forward. But I'm so very happy to really see the reform movement represented here from all over the country. And I actually remember 1997, and although when I came, I was feeling a little cold, and even then it was cold, but now I'm beginning to feel very warm. Asanteni.